Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Wired for Logic, our podcast series. And I have with me today Jonathan, who's the Chief Operating Officer of Lionheart Energy Solutions. Sorry. Jonathan can speak a little bit about what they do and what services they provide for clients. I'll let you take it away, Jonathan.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And Chief Operating Officer at Lionheart Energy. I also work as a developer for a number of my clients in the Northeast region, focusing primarily on large commercial developments as well as multifamily conversions. Run a management company, and that'd be property management and property services, as well as a consulting firm. So I'm the CEO and president of J&J Consulting. So we offer wide breadth of opportunities for various client bases, within this market sector. Lionheart Energy, focuses primarily in the Northeastern market, but is scaling across the United States. We're really looking at incentive-backed, energy solutions, primarily focusing on larger scale multifamily developments as well as commercial applications. And so, we really came into that company with the mindset and the viewpoint of, as property owners, as developers, and as property managers, we saw, kind of systematic trends of, escalation in, energy consumption, energy cost, really affecting the bottom dollar, on one hand, as that ownership and as you're acquiring, whether it's a tenant base or, or positioning something for sale, there's a lot of opportunities that have been afforded, through various, incentive-backed programs, whether that's government incentives, whether that's utility incentives. But taking those applications and learning how to apply them in the best way that's going to suit our clients' needs, utilizing programs specifically, to fund this so that it can be as minimally impactful on the capital expenditures that are necessary within a development cycle. And I think, as we talked before this podcast, there's a lot of changes going on in the market, not just, in real estate, but in electric vehicles, infrastructure, the need for such, as well as really how you plan developments, how you are putting together a dev team. So looking at your architects, your engineers, the deliverables that they're providing, and then positioning, particular assets, again, within the online space, which has become, increasingly more crucial in ensuring that really on a multifamily kind of development cycle, that it's out in the market, you have that online presence, that you're able to optimize SEOs as well as your true customer reach. And we have so many more tools that are available, today, and that are continuing to evolve, that have made it more effective with such a greater fine point to be able to be successful in each of those.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Gentleman I was talking to the other day, he does auditing and attestation for carbon footprint for clients. And he was talking about how there were some new rules going into place coming up, I think in 2026, that's going to require a lot of real estate, I guess, commercial and multifamily to do carbon footprint reporting, which sounds like a nightmare for the people who own those properties. So do you guys help optimize the energy consumption and make recommendations for what things to do to help reduce consumption?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things, and just kind of looking at, you mentioned it being a nightmare. And so property owners as a whole, are a unique class of individual, and so some are very vehemently aware of their, particular assets. They know every in and out, of their buildings. When you start really looking at large portfolios, though, it becomes more of a number than anything. You're looking at spreadsheets, right, primarily. You're not, in tune and actively on site in many circumstances. And so we really focus on that because that's more my space, large scale portfolios, $1 million to $1 billion, in those kind of asset classes. And, you start to see consumption going up. So from an optimization standpoint, and from how can we best position that building, or how can we best convert it, or how can we upgrade, we've developed a number of key tactics. And so we do this internally. And I started this with my assets, and seeing, the carry cost, that has gone up, and we could talk interest rates and, the finance sector as much as we wanted, but more so, within the scope of Lionheart and myself as a developer, really being able to go and break down consumption, understanding the kilowatt hours used, and then being able to audit what is causing this consumption. So there's been the integration of smart panels. There's been the integration of so many types of optimized and control metrics that can be implemented, whether it be on the heating and cooling side, whether it be on the lighting side, and whether it's either on flow control as it pertains to water consumption. Should you have a large scale commercial facility, like I have a tenant that, does bottling. And so they're, making juices and beverages and such. And so to be able to, not just sub meters so that you can bill accordingly, but rather be able to optimize and reduce, loss across the board. One of the topics and the tactics that I implemented in my portfolio and then have translated over into Lionheart Energy is kind of facilitating those audits. So an energy audit that's been around forever. For those of you who know, a HERS rating system, it's HERS, all caps, rating system. That's, a pretty expensive audit system. And it's really cumbersome. That's going through noting, insulation, every light, you have to have your entire lighting diagram, how many outlets, what is your total draw. So it's essentially a load calculation for an entire building that isn't just focused on electricity. It's focused on whether you've got, gas heat sources, is it forced air, what are every component of the building and how is it impacting carbon footprint? How is it impacting your consumption? And one of the things that, we were able to do is instead of, that pen and paper method, filling out these forms and, writing down numbers, not only can that be cumbersome and there's a lot of, error that can result, is there's been technologies. I use Plod, which is, a fantastic, recording app that, uses AI to be able to not just summarize, what your findings are, but be able to further break that down, customize reports, and be able to really kind of capture a full picture while combining it, with photographic evidence, videographic evidence, as well as importing of actual, utilization bills, whether that be, your bills coming from the utility company, or internal reports should you have, sub-metering or any other kind of, control mechanism, in place, and be able to compile those into very accurate, very detailed reports that can reduce the downtime for the generation of an audit that then can be used to be able to start to design the control systems or the recommended upgrades, be able to forecast, even within the utilization of that AI forecast, what is your payback period, for that investment? What are your overall savings by implementing various different options? And being able to run 3 to 4 different metrics or being able to run up to 5 different metrics and determine what is the most efficient use of not just your dollars, but your long-term investment overall from a consumption standpoint. So I have a million use cases for how that's been able to help, across property management, property development, so pre-development, like when you're still in soft, as well as what Lionheart focuses on, which is existing structures, existing, tenant bases or owners that are looking at making those capital improvements and being able to determine the best options for them to be able to, really maximize, that anticipated, CapEx expenditure.
Do you ever look at recommending things like, I know one of the clients, he purchased a building close to our office as a large 3-story, used to be a credit union headquarters, and had solar installed on the roof to help offset some of their energy usage during the day. I don't think he has any kind of battery storage, but do you guys make recommendations in those particular like green energy aspects of it, solar, Tesla Powerwalls, things like that?
Absolutely. Actually, one of my properties, and is a prime example of that. So that was one of our first, test properties. It's a 3-building parcel and 125,000 square feet total of roof line. Roof needed to be replaced. That comes with the necessitation of a rip and replace on a flat roof, reballasting. And we looked at, the sunk cost of what a roof is. Obviously, you spend, $3 to $8 million, depending on roof class, that you want to go and implement. That's a sunk cost. Are you going to recoup it in the potential of ensuring that you maintain tenants, that, you have mitigated or limited risks, with, damage potentials for those tenants? But It's also, can recoup it to a certain extent by forecasting potential losses in that sense, or inclement weather, natural disasters, that kind of thing, where you have a compromised structure. But really, it was looking at a potential sunk cost investment versus being able to go and implement solar on top of those roofs. So replace a new roof, obtain solar, and then enter into PPAs, utilize battery storage, as well as a number of control systems. So this property, really, we ran the full gambit. So it not only received an audit, which, we were able to completely eliminate fluorescent incandescent lighting, throughout the property, which had about a 30% reduction in our overall consumption of
Wow.
electricity across the board immediately. Then looking at heating and cooling systems, going from gas-fired boilers and large, 40,000 ton, cooling towers on the top of the roof, and reducing those, downsizing those, and using far more efficient, heat pump systems. And then, using system design controls, dampeners and the like, with multiple thermostats, across every single building, which a thermostat, yes, is something where you can control the temperature, but it's also a fantastic way to be able to actually see where you're heating and where you're cooling within a large building is needed. And so therefore, you have that classic case of one room is cold as can be, the other is burning up, and you're
Yep.
using the same system and there's no way to control that. And so what inadvertently happens is, depending on the time of year, you're either putting the thermostat down or putting the thermostat up. Being able to actually deliver that conditioned air into the location that is going to best suit, your client's needs or that building's needs, also significantly reduces, your overall overhead. But by integrating solar, in this particular project, we did 3 different solar arrays. 2, we entered into PPAs. And so that was a direct sell back, to the utility company. And that, of course, that offers us the ability to obtain, new roofs, have upgraded buildings, and generate new revenue streams for that asset. But the third, we did that total load calculation of the building of, hey, what is our overall consumption? And we designed that system so that it would be able to offset at least 50% of the total consumption during the day. Now, we come into the fact that not all buildings are only used during the day, especially in a commercial
Yep.
application. It is typical, a 9 to 5. However, we're located up in the Northeast. Winter comes around, it's dark as can be, by 4 or 5 p.m. So you lose that, solar capacity there. So that's where battery integration became, really key and crucial. Tesla Powerwalls are primarily focused in residential market. And so, the battery systems that we use were far, far greater than that. And, we designed software that would be able to essentially load manage those battery systems. And so, if there's excess generation on the non-PPA producing solar arrays, that's when it would be charging those battery systems. And then it would, up to a certain point, be able to not only operate essentially as a generator, should you have a loss of power, but rather to be able to ensure that you have a peak demand, or that your load management is adequate, where you're still going to have to pull from the grid. However, you're not going to have to pull as much from the grid. You never want that
Right.
battery to get completely depleted. However, so that you can have that backup capacity. But it's a highly efficient system, especially if you're not in a PPA, or you are not consuming more than what you can produce on your solar system. The third aspect that went into that property was we fully outfitted it, and this is one of the things that Lionheart really specialized in, being able to work with my building, this asset as a developer, as well as Lionheart being able to go put in, DC fast chargers, not only as another, revenue stream, but as a fantastic amenity for the tenants, a fantastic amenity for the nearby surrounding community, with large parking lots, that largely go unused, during the evening time, becomes a perfect opportunity, to be able to have, a safe place to charge this ever growing, EV car market. So we have, DC fast chargers, 240 kW. So, we're at essentially the peak of what the supercharger, can output on those. going back to load management, that's where batteries really became crucial. If you're to plug, four cars in simultaneously, your peak demand is going to be through the roof. So we actually utilized AI to be able to forecast how and when and what are the likelihoods of charging sessions, and then be able to go and load manage the chargers themselves to derate them from 240 to 120 during and utilizing power sharing. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with power sharing, but making it essentially where when you have multiple cars plugged into the same station, it's going to reduce the overall output so that the charge, you're talking 5 to 6 minute differential on a true charge cycle. However, the energy consumption is significantly less, and you're not going to get hit with astronomical demand fees from the utility. Many utilities take a look at a 30-minute session across a month period and apply demand fees as a base level on your actual bill based on that 1 30-minute session. So if you have 4 cars plugged into 4 superchargers at the same time in that stance, you could get hit with a $16,000 to $20,000 base level fee, and then you're paying for the electricity. So by being able to incorporate the batteries, not just within the buildings, but be able to run power over to them. So we've got solar coming in, software is indicating we have a charging session that's starting, being able to cycle that battery in so that we don't have to derate the charger all the way down to 120. We can still provide that 240 power, but it is not drawing from the grid. So it's only drawing 120 from the grid, and then we're able to draw 120 from those batteries, which these can be as complex or as simple conversations or kind of topics as we want. But I found that to be just a really cool example of kind of utilizing all the technologies available, optimizing a building, providing additional revenue streams, and working with new technologies to be able to really incorporate software that just wasn't available until really this year. This year is when we were really able to get in there and be able to process the level of data that would be needed to be able to make those predictive measures.
That's incredible. I can speak from my own personal experience regarding battery storage. I think I have about like 37 panels on the roof, produces about a max of 12 to 13 kilowatt hours worth of production at any given point in time. When I got the panels, I hadn't done a whole lot of research, and it was just like, hey, they're giving out credits, great. I like solar, it offsets usage, awesome, let's do it, right? So they installed the panels, and it was great during the day, but one of the things that started to become apparent was if we're only producing during the day, we're only offsetting our usage during the day, we don't work from home, how much is it really, truly benefiting us? And the excess is getting sold back to the grid at pennies on the dollar. So what are we actually saving? Then I talk with them about, hey, what does it cost to do like a Tesla Powerwall to get some backup batteries? So yeah, you can do 2 and that'll run the whole house and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, okay, let's do that. To get those installed. And then the exact scenarios that you're talking about, being able to, it's technology that's built into the controller is when it's producing during the day, it's charging the batteries. We're pulling from the batteries as we use. It auto negotiates if there's excess beyond, like the batteries get charged to 100% by like 2 p.m. or 3 p.m., then it's kicking the rest back to the grid. Then once the solar production goes down, it starts pulling from the battery. So it's solar and the battery simultaneously. And then once the solar drops off completely, it's only battery. Then when the battery gets down to a certain level, then it's only grid. So
Bingo.
The fact that it's able to negotiate all that stuff, and it detects a storm, it'll start charging the batteries and all that kind of stuff. But having that technology there, like you were describing, avoiding overages during peak demand and being able to predict when that is. And that's fascinating to me. Like I was listening to that and my brain was just going in a million directions. I'm like, man, that's really cool that you guys created basically a custom application that controls the solar, the battery storage, and the charging to get them to all integrate together.
Exactly. And that's one of the key components that, none of those in particular are new technologies, right? Everything has been out. We've known Tesla superchargers for 10 years now. We know solar for 30 years, or actually, I think first one was 1880 or something like that was the first solar array that was built. I listened to a podcast on that not too long ago, which is fascinating. Each of those systems and technology has been around. I think the ability to kind of quickly transform the software to be able to maximize is really where we're seeing so many of those efficiencies be able to assist, not just my portfolio, not just the portfolios that I represent, but many of our clients across Lionheart, can really take advantage of that. At the start of that discussion, it was talking about the utilization of AI on audits. We talked to so many customers that were just so frustrated with the fact of how long it takes to perform not just the audit, but to process the data, to then be able to design systems to best support them. And they have no idea what that costing is going to look like. They don't really know what the savings are. And you were talking about a 6 to 12 month, kind of cycle time there. And that was an industry norm. Like when we first got into the space, like that's basically what all of our competition was saying. 6 to 12 months just to know if there's anything here, for you. And that doesn't even, count implementation, lead time on the particular components that may or may not be recommended. You're really looking at, a long duration. And to be able to reduce that and, is it 100% accurate? No, not all the time. Not all the time. However, you're able to at least get ballpark data in minutes, be able to know this is approximately where we are. Now, do we then need to go implement that and ensure that it's engineered correctly and that all data was inputted correctly and that those systems and those recommendations are feasible given present conditions that can't be observed other than in person, and by a qualified individual? Absolutely. However, you're able to do a load calculation, by merely walking around and vocally saying, what are you seeing in real life? And then being able to spit that data out, table format, or however, your company or your use case, needs it, and be able to process that based on, your uploaded history and, any of the data sets that have been previously provided or formats. And that is a beautiful, beautiful tool because people are people and there's always mistakes that can be made. However,
Yep.
when you're looking at designing, multi-million-dollar systems, those mistakes can be categorical. And whether it's qualification for a specific incentive, whether it's misleading a customer accidentally, by saying you can
Right.
achieve this savings and they're factoring financials based on that, really being able to much faster be able to put together a general idea of what you have in place and what direction we can go. It just makes it where you can make quicker, more educated decisions, for your business and for your clients. And it's just really, it's been a wonderful, wonderful use case that it's one of many, but yeah.
So do you guys do the audits just for pitching ways to optimize the energy, or do you also do the audits for the reporting, like I was talking about with the gentleman that I
Yeah.
spoke to the other day for the EPA requirements and things like that?
Yeah. So both.
Okay.
I think that the vast majority is for, it's not just the recommendations because we're for full service contractors. So it's not just the recommendation, it's a white glove service. We can design the system, deliver and implement this system for your building without you having to really pick up a finger. And that's the overall goal. Property owners, property managers, and there's many other industries that we serve. You have your job. Taking on something like that is cumbersome. It can be scary at times. It can be
Yep.
overwhelming. The overall goal is to take that out of their hands in the sense of we got you, and we have the way where you can have visibility into the whole process, understand what's going on with reporting metrics, but that we're able to go and effectively implement is the crucial component. Creating a report is very nice. If that report isn't implemented, all it is a piece of paper or a spreadsheet that you've been delivered. Now, when we talk about reporting, that is something that obviously is coming into effect in 2026, but we've actually been doing that for 2 years now because we are required to report on our electric vehicle charging programs. We utilize, a number of incentive-backed programs from an infrastructure standpoint, to ensure that within the Northeast region, which has the fastest growing number of electric vehicles, that are being registered and purchased each and every year, the secondhand and thirdhand market has picked up astronomically in that space. And the charging infrastructure has largely been centered. I'm sorry, I thought it cut out for a second. Largely been centered on, municipal projects or, kind of some of the federal funded like turnpike projects and such. Structure was lagging dramatically. There was reports of up to 4 to 5 hour wait times to be able to get into a charging station, 2 years ago.
4 or 5 hours?
4 or 5 hours on the Merritt Parkway or
Wow.
on the I-95 corridor where there was 4 or 5 chargers in totality that had
Lord.
capabilities there. People just waiting for hours and hours and hours. And, we took that and said, look, if you're not able to charge at work or you're not able to charge at home, this is more on the level 2 side. So we talked about, level 3 DC fast chargers earlier, but on the level
Mhm.
2 side, I look at microcharging as one of the crucial components of what's needed to ensure sufficient infrastructure across the board. We're not making It is no longer an effective means or an effective cost metric to create gas stations essentially for charging. That is a central point that it creates clog points, better uses of land. There's better uses of public land specifically than to create a queue of charging stations. Now,
Right.
if that becomes an amenity at your office or that becomes an amenity at your apartment building or at your home, that categorically changes your life. If you're an EV driver and you don't have direct access to the ability to charge, whether it's a 4 or 5 hour wait time doesn't matter. Even if it's 30 minutes and you're on your lunch break and you're having to go and try to identify where you're going to be able to charge, that is incredibly affecting your life. You're not getting that
Yes.
downtime. You're focused on trying to find a solution. So there is a number of programs that have been implemented across the US and the markets that we're in within the Northeast. It's usually utility backed, and we go and implement at those stations, across the board. But part of that is the agreements that we enter into are the data reporting. So it's a mass collection of how many charging sessions, where are these, from a GPS coordinate standpoint, the API integration within the utility so that we can have live updates and live data, see who's charging right now, where, when, how effective has that charging session, how effective has that charging station been, what's its overall use rate, what is its overall uptime. And that's really also been able to aggregate that data and better understand who are the good manufacturers, who are the good software providers, like
Right.
what is the best case scenario, what is the worst case scenario, is it effective to put a level 2 charging station at a gas station? We found based on data and analytics that it's not, it's just not. Office buildings tend to get significantly more usage. And that's again, because people are going to work, they're able to charge for that, 6 hour workday.
Yep.
They're able to get 100% charge and they're able to go home. They're not having to take off of work. They're not having to worry about it after work. That's a quality of life thing. Same with multifamilies. Within the Connecticut market, there's legislation that passed this year. And actually it passed last year and went into effect this year, that any project or redevelopment that exceeds a permit value of $100,000, which is a very low number in the commercial real estate world,
Oh,
you
yeah.
are required to implement 10% of your parking spaces with electric vehicle charging stations. So that is a categorical fact that has to go in there. And that can be a very, very costly, kind of aside. We talked about changing a roof. You have a roof repair. I'm not talking full roof replacement. I'm talking you have a roof repair. Most cases, that's over $100K. Now all of a sudden you're having to trench your parking lot and, put in level 2 charging stations when that wasn't on, your CapEx budget, guaranteed. And so we
Yep.
try to be proactive in that and look at buildings that are maybe going to be going under that repair. If we've been contracted to do an audit, we know you're about to spend more money than that permit value is going to allow. And we immediately say, we need to integrate these. That usually comes with upgrading of panels, getting new services put in so that they can be upgraded and updated, more efficient wiring. And again, we haven't fully gotten approval yet, but I'm very excited to see some of the new smart panels that are coming out, which is not only going to be so much better for the reporting that you're talking about, but whether it's on the residential and consumer side or on the commercial side, that's the next step of where I'm very excited for how that's going to work, because that's another layer of not just data, but having control over how and where power is going when.
Yep.
And that's something, that I'm very excited about on the next step of where these technologies are going.
No, yeah, that's all very interesting. And I think like one of the issues we ran into, like you're talking about upgrading wiring and panels and all that kind of stuff. I hadn't thought about this. Is before I had a like an X5 5E. It has like 30
That's what I
miles
have.
worth of range, so it just a small battery, but enough to get to and from work most days. I didn't have to use a whole lot of gas. It was nice, but it'd take forever to charge because I only had the 120. And I
Yep.
went ahead and got
Man, dude, you probably had to charge for 24 hours.
yeah, it's like 12 or 14 hours to charge a 30-mile range. It was ridiculous. I got our garage wired up with 220 on either side, and
Yep.
if it's direct wired, it'll charge up to like 48 amps.
You got
The vehicle,
a wall box?
yeah, I got a charge point
Yeah, perfect.
charging, and they're really nice. And I started using that for I got a new vehicle. I got an XM, and now with
That's
the
what I
new
have.
charge
Yeah.
point, you have an XM?
Yeah. Yeah. And I have a wall box. I got it installed. Same situation. I started with the 120. It was going to take, I swear to you, it said 24-hour charge time when I first plugged in. Next day, BMW wall box was installed, and I'm down 3 hours usually max if I'm on zero, but life-changing.
Oh, it totally is. And if I go home for lunch or anything like that, I can plug it in. And I've got like at least a quarter recharge on the battery just for it sitting there for 30 minutes or an hour.
Yeah.
So it's been incredible. But what was funny when we're talking about load and upgrading and all that kind of stuff, I thought, oh yeah, super great. Put 220 on either side. One thing that I didn't think about was the fact that our oven is electric. Our dryer is electric. And so there was one day that we had the oven going, the dryer was going, and I was charging the XM, and it flipped the main breaker. I was like,
Bingo.
wow, I didn't think that was possible. But I guess the 32 to 48
No,
amps on the charger, the draw from the dryer, and so yeah, you got to
well,
think about all that
no,
stuff, and all that goes into the planning, like you're talking about. Like if you're going to have
yeah,
X number of charging stations, what kind of power is that going to draw? And you need to plan for that.
exactly.
Like what's the max capacity it's going to be drawing at the same time to make sure you give yourself enough wiggle room that you're not like right there on the line, and the instant it goes over, it starts tripping breakers and blowing circuits and stuff.
No, and that's number one. Your E1 electrician should have done a load calculation to make sure that circuit wasn't too much. But that is the number one thing that we see. So you probably have a 100 amp, maybe a max 200 amp panel, load calculations are done, but it's on the assumption of course, that nothing is going to be running all the time, always. However,
Right.
that circumstance is exactly, especially in commercial buildings. Okay, those systems are running. You have a heavy piece of equipment or you have machinery. Home Depot was one of our clients. That was one of those. During operating hours, as we were running it, we were like, look, we're going to have to do a new pedestal service. We're going to have to get you a transformer, or we're going to have to do a pretty major overhaul of your panel to ensure that you're never going to have that happen. Much more important is when you start looking into the medical field, the amount of power that could be drawn, from a hospital or from an urgent care or something where you do not have the ability, to just have a breaker flip. Like
Yeah,
of course you need the
I gotta work in a
redundancies there,
hospital.
but it's one of those where they're bound by the same rules though. And so if you're having to put in, high draw mechanisms, and you have to even for those customers who have taken that proactive step of going completely, total electricity, and are recognizing that, they should transition from gas, and go full electric, it comes with that added cost of the panel upgrades, making sure that you're there. And that's really why I like the smart panels, is because it will be able to detect that, and, can either throttle, so on certain, at least chargers, on the wall box, you can throttle that charger so that, basically, it's not going to overload the circuit. But if you're running all at the same time, these smart panels have the ability to either send a warning message before you throw a breaker, or immediately notify you, or at least say, hey, on this circuit, like you're getting really, really close here. And that's on the residential side. On the commercial side, it has so many more amazing benefits. just in the sense of if you know on a certain circuit, that's your lighting systems, maybe one of the sensors has failed or something like that. You're able to very quickly pick up on the fact that, hey, I've got a sensor out and I shouldn't be seeing, current coming through because the lights should be off, at midnight, the office is closed.
Right.
You're able to go and mitigate that, pretty quickly. Same with flow control mechanisms on water. Water leaks at large commercial properties or multifamilies, you know, largely go unreported, until pretty recently because, you've got a leaking toilet or you've got, a leak, somewhere after the water meter that could go undetected for an astronomical amount of time. And
Oh
so
yeah.
being able to have multimeters throughout and be able to detect that early on and be able to get that notification, be able to address it quickly, you know, it, prior it would be just looking at your utility bill at the end of the month and being like, wait a second, like what is going on over here? Why in the world did this go up 40%? Did the rate change? How did I use that much water? And we've had it. There's an example. I had a client had a fire hydrant on their property. So, it's city fire hydrant. However, it's an after the meter fire hydrant. And so oftentimes, city utility easements, elect for large commercial buildings where, you have a hydrant to be able to address a potential fire at that facility. It's a behind the meter, which you always agree to. Number one, because it's health and safety. But number two is because in most circumstances, you're not using a fire hydrant unless your building's burning down. And so there's no
Right.
consumption, there's no cost to it. However, if that hydrant is leaking, say they do a test and they don't turn the valve all the way, which was the case here, the fire engine drove by, actually broke the pipe underneath when they were doing one of the tests. And it was 6 months of a full main leaking underground that was only caught because it started to form a sinkhole in the parking lot. And,
Eesh.
ownership's getting the bill. It's just on auto pay. It's a $30 million facility. Yes,
Oh
it's
my
a
God.
big line item and that's an issue, but that's de minimis in the grand scheme of things. Until you break it down, you're like, you just paid $10,000 a month over in water. Not only is it the money, it's, we were in a drought. We were in a drought at that time. Like the amount of water that was just being wasted that couldn't be caught because you don't have these kind of metrics. And
Yep.
because it's not being analyzed is one of the drivers and one of the things we're excited about and how we can implement those.
Well, that's incredible. I mean, if you have, like you said, flow controls, my brain's going 1,000 miles an hour thinking about all the possibilities. If you're monitoring, like you said, having multiple meters, flow controls, monitoring how much water is being used, and then you're comparing it month to month. If you have some kind of automated system to compare and then alert you, if all of a sudden it's like, hey, man, you guys usually use however many gallons per hour or however many gallons per day or however many gallons per month, but you all of a sudden have this huge spike in usage, that's concerning. For example, you have a huge water main break that nobody knows about because it's under the ground. It's been going on for the
Yep.
last 2 weeks. You can catch that earlier than, hey, it's been going on for 6 months and now, $1,000 later worth of unused water that's just been going down to the ground.
Plus the parking lot repair, plus, plus the disruption to your
Right,
operation at the
right. All of
building,
that. I
plus
mean,
all
all
of
of that
those things.
can be avoided if it's caught early and fixed. And then talking about too with the electricity, like if there's sensors that are out, like occupancy sensors that are not functioning and lights are just staying on 24/7. Yeah, it's not good. Talking about balancing AC, I was just in our office downstairs. I kept noticing when I would go downstairs to grab lunch, it's like, man, why is it like freezing down the hallway, but it's cool, but it's not as cool towards the front. And of course, it's got windows and all that kind of stuff towards the front, and in the back it doesn't. But making sure that's balanced, that way you're not running the AC in excess to cool the front area, and in the back of the building is like a freezer because it's just not
Exactly.
balanced correctly. It's all that stuff just. And you could save so much money in commercial spaces by optimizing all that. But in order to optimize it, you have to know what's not working the way it needs to or where the waste is happening in order to put
Bingo.
those fixes in place.
Well, it's, maybe not technology, specific, but just, one example of that is you are completely correct. And that's one of the great things about the technologies that we work with, for those systems controls. But insulation is another huge component of that.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got stack effect or you've got heat loss that, is just out of control, you can optimize, and that's what we found. So we usually couple, most of our provisions do incorporate upgraded insulation. The new technologies for being able to deliver that insulation are fantastic. I mean, we're talking pinhole point, drill sets, to be able to go and put in spray insulation that can, go from a R20, insulation on the exterior walls, that was, code compliant up until 2025 code change, up to R60, R80,
Wow.
that is absolutely changing the game, because now you have an optimized system, but also, your heat loss overall is just incredibly better off. You've got such a better weather sealed building. And ultimately that's one of the biggest things that we see. There's some great so insulation has been huge. There's a fantastic new product that's coming out on the market that I want to say it's 8 millimeters thin, and it's vacuum sealed with titanium pins for windows. So, windows obviously have an R value as well. And we all know, the triple pane Pella window for, $5,000 is, the best residential grade window you could possibly get.
Yep.
But in commercial applications, there's no triple paned windows that are happening. Large sheet glass is never going to happen. The fact that they've developed, an 8 millimeter, window with vacuum seal and titanium pins delivering an R value of 20 is incredible. And so that's that next step of being able to take that from a smaller scale, where you could probably implement a 36 by 36 at this point, but developing production into large sheet applications where, storefronts, where large towers, where large commercial facilities can, implement those window systems either on retrofit or on initial design. That is going to be a huge game changer, just in the sense of being able to further optimize your energy consumption.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The front area of our building is like, floor to ceiling windows, 8-10 feet tall, and they're like 4 feet wide, and there's like 6 of them. And then it transitions to rock for the back part. And that's the back part that's nice and cool. And the front part that's got all the glasses,
Yeah.
So yeah, that's interesting.
You got a greenhouse.
Yeah, pretty much. We do have overhang over part of that, and so it blocks out part of the sun, but there's still the heat exchange between outside and inside. So and single pane, obviously, but that's interesting. I'd like to find out more about the commercial applications. Not like I would pay to do it here, because obviously we're renting, but it's interesting just to be aware. I like new technologies. I'm interested by stuff like that. Obviously I'm in the technology field. So what's been like one of the biggest projects you guys have done that, like, if you could convince every one of your clients to do this, like, oh man, if price was no object and this guy was like John Hammond from Jurassic Park and he just write a blank check, I do these things at every commercial property, what would that be?
I think always combining multiple provisions. So there's no single change, other than I will stand by that lighting can be the quickest, easiest, and most cost-effective means to save money. If you are still using fluorescents, those are typically between 80 and 120 watts. And that's a lot of power draw. If you look at large buildings, changing, just the ballast on ballasted systems like that could be $120. We're talking, midstream market, on LED 2x4 panels, for $15. Like, that is the most cost effective, that has the quickest payback period, that is the number one change. And there's a quality of life increase as well, because the fluorescents, they are what they are. On the LEDs, you're able to make it softer. You can change that environment within your building very quickly. Right. And be reducing the power. So that's the number one. Exterior lights in the same situation. You're using, high wattage incandescents, which are, the standard that you see on the side of a building, or on pole lights. Switching those over to high efficiency, high power LEDs, that's a huge one. If you have any kind of pitched roof, putting in insulation and putting in additional weather sealings and vapor barriers, that's going to be the number one thing, especially if you're in cooler climates, to maintaining, a warm building or a warm home, even, during the cooler months. Combining and either working, obviously, come contact us if you're in the Northeast, and, we'll work with you and work with your local utility to maximize incentives. Regardless of the incentives, by combining multiple provisions, looking at your HVAC, looking at your lighting systems, looking at your control systems, and combining those is what's going to yield the most positive results. And, you mentioned it just then, you're a tenant, you're renting your space. As we look at, office commercial market, across the United States, taking a real hit, with people working from home, being able to work remote, kind of decentralizing, the office infrastructure that we've seen, for the past 100 years, really, really paying attention to that and making it where it's cost effective for your tenants to still maintain, that office space. Landlords, owners are having to recognize that those investments are going to pay back because you're going to be able to retain those tenants. And that's really been one of the big, not just selling points of what we do, but I think selling points of a mentality change across the ownership basis, where it's not saying deferred maintenance. It is saying that this is an investment that has a payback. Even if the tenant is paying the electricity, the payback is coming because you are staying and your overhead is being lowered. And that allows for, rent increases to stay in line with taxes, and to be in line where you're not pricing people out and kind of forcing the hand of many of companies who have, done a 30% work from home or, greater in some cases, or never came back from COVID. And, we see that as studies have now come out suggesting that, well, it was very effective for a couple of years. Companies are seeing productivity loss, from a work from home model, and that there is value in having that sense of community there. So
Oh,
there's been
100%.
there's been disruption in that. And I think that the re-envisioning of what investing in your property means and how you can recoup those investments is really being realized as we see, these higher electricity costs and higher OpEx.
Yeah, for sure. I know one of our franchise clients, Glow Tanning, it's a tanning salon. And so their beds, I think all their beds probably are on 220 outlets. So I'm sure their energy consumption is just
Yeah.
through the roof. I know they have some vendor they use for, I don't know how it optimizes the power, but they do some kind of power optimization. That was the first time that I was aware that that was a big deal in the commercial space. We do a lot of
Yeah.
IT stuff, but we don't get into, like, even though there's a lot of technology like you're describing, integrating those systems together that you can do now. I know that when we did that Keller Williams building I was telling you about earlier, that's a 3-story, you were talking about HVAC systems and all of that stuff. They used to have those big chillers, and there was like a whole
Yeah.
corner of each floor of the building that had these units. There was an entire, like, I don't know, 20 by 40-foot room with these things in there.
Yeah.
And they were able to get rid of those and put a single unit, I think, up on the roof that services the whole building now. I'm like, that's incredible. Just
Yeah.
all those
He
efficiencies.
heat pump RTU, amazing. It's efficient. But as you're noting, and this is one of and I'm glad you brought it up, because this is one of the key things. Building design as a whole, as we're talking about these, the dedication when you were in the design build phase of a construction project, and you're having to allocate, let's say 2,000 square feet, of your floor for a mechanical room and an electrical room and even a server room, where now you're able to either reduce or eliminate that. That is rentable square footage. That is a net tangible increase in the value of your property by
Yes.
implementing something that's more efficient overall. However, you don't have to deal with it anymore. And I say servers because by working with, data centers and cloud-based, storage and server room that can be secure, can still be firewalled. Those are other applications that, as we do tenant fit outs, every single tenant, up until maybe 4 years ago, was still requiring, an on-site server room with their firewall. By being able to either put that in a more efficient place or allocate that out, into a cloud-based service and still have, low latency to access that data in a secure way, that's, again, more rentable square footage that you're going to be able to actually functionally use.
Yeah, the same way that you were talking about those systems that, we've had solar for a while, we've had charging for a while, we've had the battery for a while, but the technology finally maturing enough to where you can integrate those systems together. It's the same kind of thing with IT, like you're talking about downsizing the amount of server infrastructure that clients have or completely eliminating it. But we've had to get to this point where cloud is mature enough to handle that, and we have enough internet infrastructure and speeds in order to handle that. Because people don't like slow, they don't like waiting, they don't like delays. They need quick responsiveness, and you have to have good internet connectivity in order to do that. With a lot of providers, gigabit internet is pretty common nowadays. You don't
Yeah,
have to.
fiber is everywhere.
Yeah,
If you're not getting
yeah,
one
it's
gig, like
much different.
I don't know what you're doing. And yeah, I mean, the reduced cost of the high density servers as a whole has been a fantastic development. Now, we could also talk about the energy consumption that these server farms, are in these data centers are actually using, and how microgrids and how, alternative energies can supplement batteries, try to be able to better create efficient buildings specifically for this new use that is a mass need for high density servers with low latency spread across the country. And we've got the big boys and the big players, but 3 Mile Island is back online. Why is it back online? Because there's 1 million square foot of high density servers that needed to be operated at all times, for that project. And that nuclear facility is back online. It's because there was not enough energy in the entirety of the Northeast to be able to support the AI demand needs for what they have now and for the growth of how those servers are going to go.
Yeah, I know they've got that here in Texas. I can't remember if it's in Abilene or where it is that they're building that Project Stargate or whatnot. I can't imagine the amount of energy consumption.
I mean, Musk put out something that just like it got me going so much this summer, because I was working on a project from, it's funny you said it earlier, a micro hydro plant, which was focused on a micro data center. So very bespoke situation, but kind of as a test case. But he put out a statement pertaining to the server needs based on his projections of AI development over the next 5 years, and the power consumption that would be needed to support that projection exceeded our total consumption over the past 5 years within the United States. The other side of it is he coupled that with China is bringing on 1 megawatt of renewable energies a day in comparison.
Right.
And to add 1 megawatt to the grid every single day of just renewables is incredible. But we are not maintaining that same pace, not even close. Most of our coal-fired is not nearly as possible, but the vast majority, we're still looking at gas-powered, power plants. At least, in the Northeast. Texas has actually made incredible efforts on the renewable side. They're one of the leaders right now. Granted, you're massive state and have the sunshine and then the flatness to be able to support that. But there's so many things to look at. But it also brings up the conversation in Australia, where they have the highest amount of renewables per capita, that they actually exceed the production during the daytime on solar than they do at their actual power plants. And they have basically a velocity problem where they are exporting so much power from solar during the days that they've implemented programs where they're literally buying electric vehicles just to store the power, because it's cheaper than getting the batteries at this point. So they plug them in during the day and are trying to operate buildings off of cars at night because of so much solar adoption. So to be able to go from low voltage back into high voltage is a very difficult task. It's feasible. However, it's a very difficult task in that way. And so some of those problems and some of those solutions even have been really creative. And I still think that it's very rapidly, and we're going to see some really cool solutions, in the coming years.
Interesting. Well, we're coming up on the hour. I wanted to get kind of your closing thoughts on, in your particular space, where you see technology growing or going, and how you see the use of AI in what you guys do day to day, how you see that growing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've kind of covered, all of the positive natures of just, the technology and software incorporation of how building systems can be more efficient. I can speak, for AI itself, I use every day, all day for so many tasks, the automation, the fact checking, to be able to quickly assess reports, be able to quickly put out reports, be able to effectively manage teams, and, utilizing not just as, that personal assistant component, but to be able to bounce ideas, structures, all of those things, I think that it's going to be hugely advantageous in the sense of just productivity increases, as well as the ability to really flesh out ideas that maybe could have taken years and years to
Hmm.
research, to quickly be able to get, at least some kind of indication of, hey, is this idea viable? And I see new use cases coming with AI every single day as it pertains to energy efficiency, property management. There is a million use cases that are there that can create better experiences, for, whether it's from a portfolio perspective of how you manage your portfolio, to how, your tenants experience can be, and also on the commercial or retail side, how is that customer experience, going to be in store, or if they're automated learning, the AI functionality of being able to integrate, across all of these platforms is truly transforming the game. And I think that whether you're a mom and pop shop or a massive portfolio owner, there is a use case for you. And it's a relatively easy and inexpensive barrier to entry to really start to optimize your systems and start to really ramp up, the overall experience within your business and potentially, with your employees. I don't see AI taking over the world. I don't see AI replacing, all jobs. I'm not, on that train, but I do see the ability to really be able to take a lot of time and give it back to a lot of people that can then
Yeah.
focus on things that are going to improve their quality of life or improve their businesses.
100% increase profitability and quality of life at the same time. A lot of
Bingo.
people, rail against AI. Oh, it's going to take jobs and this and that. We want to use AI for new client acquisition. And in doing that, more clients means we need more technicians to help service those clients. So we're looking to create more jobs using AI. And I'm excited about that. I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Hey, and better paying jobs than cold callers or than data entry, that
Yep.
creates a better quality of job. It creates a better overall economy and job market by, again, not eliminating, but by making it where you can train and be able to have a whole new infrastructure that's surrounded around actual productivity and not laborious tasks or, any things that, client acquisition. No, we don't want to focus on that. You want to focus
Yep.
on how you can help your clients.
Yep. 100%. Well,
Beautiful.
Jonathan, I really appreciate your time today. I really enjoyed the conversation. I feel like we barely scratched the surface, and maybe we do this again.
Yeah, I would love to. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You have a
Very
wonderful
much.
rest of your day and a great week.
You too now. Thank you so much.
Thanks.